Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of online classes and members all across 150 countries who come together to find inspiration and take the next step in their creative journey. From my time here and my past comments, I realize how a lot of you are interested in learning a little bit about calligraphy. So today I'd like to recommend a class for you that I recently took, which is called Calligraphy Essentials, a 10-day challenge by Bryn Chernoff, who has been working professionally as a calligrapher, hand letterer, and illustrator since 2007. Just like the title says, this is a 10-day class, so each lesson is dedicated to a day of short exercises following the worksheets that Bryn provided for us to download. I find that the way this class has been put together is really reasonable and approachable for beginners. She demonstrates as well as instructs the exercises so we can follow along day by day as we slowly develop our fine muscles for calligraphy, but at the same time she also encourages us to be creative at the same time. The way this class was presented was so calming that the exercises can become somewhat of a meditation and a relaxing part of our day, and there's really no pressure as the lessons per day are quite short and comprehensive, so it's easy to fit into our schedule. Make 2023 a year you perfect a new creative hobby, and if this sounds like something you might be interested in, the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description box will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a flowery fence. For this painting, I decided to paint a bush of hydrangeas, but you can also do this with any of your favorite flower bushes. You can start out by masking the sides, but since I'm painting on a watercolor block and I don't really want to create a frame for this painting, I'm going to sketch straight away. The first thing I want to do is establish where the position of my fence is going to be. I decided to place them slightly lower than halfway, and I started out by ruling out 2 lines horizontally for the wooden board holding the fence together. Then I want to find the midway point and drawing 2 vertical lines there, and also freehanding the top part first freehand since the length is not too long and it's much easier to visualize and estimate the distance when drawing freehand. Once I've established the more or less even spacing on both the left and the right side, then I use the ruler to line the bottom part of the fence using the top part as guide. For the top of the fence, you can create different designs like simple arches or anything you have in mind. I want the top of my fence to have this rounded arrow, so I first line the top to measure the height of where all the arrows are going to be. Then I'm going to draw the individual shapes until I reach that line. At this point, I'm not too worried about the 3-dimensional form, I just want to make neat flat shapes. Once I'm done, I'm going to erase the guidelines as well as the bottom of the fence where I'm going to be painting some flower bush. Once the fence is nice and neat, I'm going to scatter the flowers around. I want some flowers to peek through the fence, and I'm just going to loosely indicate those flowers by drawing circles in different sizes because I'm going to paint hydrangeas. I also want to place some leaves outside of the fence and try to make the placement as fluid as possible by not placing any of the shapes on a straight line. I also want to place clumps of those circles overlapping each other on top of the fence. Some might also pull over the top of the fence if you want to, but don't forget to leave out some negative space as well for the leaves and foliage. Once I'm happy with how the flowers are placed and how they're overlapping with each other, I just want to erase whatever is inside of those circles so it doesn't distract me as I'm painting. Next, here are the colors I'll be using. This is Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Sepia by Hobein, Indigo by Schminke, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Chinese White by Hobein, Ultramarine Finest by Schminke, Sap Green by Hobein, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. Let's begin to paint. I'm going to start out by watering or dampening the surface at the bottom here because I want this area to be painted loosely. While I'm at it, I also want to pull a bit of that water to the bottom part of the space in between the fences. While the surface is still damp, I want to mix up some Sap Green with New Gamboge to create a yellow-green color, and I'm using a medium to thick consistency here and scattering this color around the bottom of the fence. Then with a clean damp brush, I'm going to pull some of the colors very lightly in between the fence. I want to work fairly quickly since I want to work on the damp surface. For the darker green that I'm placing here, I used a mix of that yellow green with some indigo and sepia. I used a thin consistency to paint in between the fence just to separate the back of the fence and the front. And with a slightly thicker consistency, I'm going to place it underneath the yellow-green color, and I'm still going to place them randomly while playing around with the ratio to create different variations of the color. If the paint isn't traveling as much as you want, you can also pull and move the paint around like what I'm doing here. I'm just flicking with the tip of my brush to create a bushy texture, and if some parts are too dark, you can also take off the excess pigment or paint using tissue. Next, here I'm painting on the leaves using the light yellow-green color that's peeking through the fence, and I just want to make sure that I get the positioning correctly. When you're painting the leaves, make sure that you know if they're attached to one branch or separate branches. This will help in the positioning of those leaves. So for instance, the leaves that I'm painting now is attached to one branch, therefore the bottom of each leaf is facing the same direction. For my composition, I'm only going to paint those leaves peeking through the fence, so I'm going to move on to paint the flowers in front of the fence. I want my hydrangeas to be blue with hints of purple and tiny accents of pink, so I'm going to begin by using a light blue mix from a mix of Ultramarine Finest with the tiniest bit of Quin Red to brighten the blue slightly and some white to turn the color pastel. I'm going to use a thin consistency to paint the base color on a dry surface while tapping with the tip of my brush in different directions to create a flowery texture. Especially around the edges, I want them to be uneven and for the center to have some white negative space here and there so it doesn't look too bulky. I try to make sure to paint with a medium to light load so the base color is evenly damp instead of puddling wet, and I tried to place this light value mostly on the top right corner. While the surface is still damp, I'm going to use a slightly darker value of the same color, which is basically the same mix with less white, and apply it the same way by tapping the tip of my brush in different directions from the bottom left and gradually reaching the damp surface of the previous light color. I tried to also tap in some of this color a little bit randomly around the center so the surface looks a bit more textured and uneven. For the hydrangea that I'm painting here, since it's placed underneath the flowers that I already painted, I'm going to use a darker value as the lightest value this time. Then for the shadow color, I added a bit of indigo to the Ultramarine Finest to create a darker value. I'm also going to use the same mix in a lighter consistency to paint some shadows for some of the flowers that I've already painted, just to make them pop out a little bit more with better form. This is where I start varying the color a little bit more. I added more Quin Red in the ratio so the color becomes a bit more purple. And just like before, I used a thin consistency and a lighter value by adding white and a darker value for the bottom left. I'm just going to continue to do this and paint the flowers, which are interacting mostly with the fence. And while I'm at it, I also like to slowly build the darker values at the bottom until I'm happy with the round form of the flowers. Once I've mostly painted the flowers in front of the fence, I'm going to mask the fence so it's easier to paint the flowers behind them without having to be too careful to avoid painting those areas. For the straight lines, as you can see, I just cut up my masking tape according to the length and the width of the fence while leaving out the space for the fence detail as arrows, because I'm going to do this with masking fluid instead so I can mask off the exact same shapes. While I'm waiting for the masking fluid to dry, I'm going to paint the green foliage behind the fence or the bottom of the fence. I started by painting some random leaves using the light green from New Gamboge and Sap Green. Then I tried to fill in the rest of the space using a darker value by adding indigo or sepia into the sap green and using a thicker consistency. I don't really want the lighter green leaves to pop here, so I'm not going to wait for them to dry before painting on the darker values. This way the colors will just mingle and blend with each other, creating a blurry background. I also placed a couple of flower clumps using the blue that I already had on my palette, but since I don't want the flowers to get muddy, I left out a bit of space in between the flowers so the green doesn't mix with the bluish purple. While I'm painting the background, I do want to be very careful to avoid painting on the leaves in front of the fence, because what we're painting now is the background and supposed to be behind those flowers and leaves in front of the fence. On the top left part of the fence, I felt like it'll be nice to have a large leaf draping down to connect to the clump of flowers here. So I decided to take off a bit of masking tape and paint on one large leaf. After that, I'm going to continue painting on the flowers, which are going to be behind the fence using the same method as before. Since there are a lot of flowers on the top left side of the fence here, I'm being a bit more bold with my darker values so I can separate those flowery orbs individually. For the darker values, I used a thicker consistency of indigo with Ultramarine Finest, and I used this color for the flowers which are somewhat buried behind the lighter flowers in front. While painting the groups of flowers, I also want to paint the leaves which are going to be attached to those flowers using the lightest value of the greens, and if they're overlapping each other, I'd use a darker value to separate the leaves. I'm being quite sparing with the leaves here so I can create more depth in the background with the blurred effect. Meanwhile, I'm just going to continue painting on the flowers using the colors that I used before. Don't forget to also play around with the ratio to create different tones as well. Once I'm done with another group of flowers on the right here, I'm going to paint on the leaves. You can also add a branch to help visualize where the leaves are going to be attached. In between the top part of the fence, I'm going to start painting on more leaves. This one is going to be a bit more defined. I'm just going to scatter them around and then fill in the space in between the leaves using a darker value. Once I feel like I have enough of the lighter leaves, I'm going to fill in the rest of the space using a dark green. Just like before, you can either use indigo with sap green or sepia with sap green, or mix all three colors and even add a little bit of New Gamboge for different variations of the color. For the leaves at the top, since most of them are painted using the light yellow-green mix, I decided to add more leaves using the darker green value, and I'm going to place these darker leaves behind the lighter ones that I've already painted, so this way there's a little bit of layering going on. Once I'm happy with the spread of leaves and the silhouette of the overall composition, I'm going to add more leaves as the background using a thin consistency or a light consistency of the different variations of the green tones. So this can be the dark green or the light yellow-green color. I just want this to be very light so it looks like it's placed behind the ones that we've already painted. Once I've painted all around the fence, next I'm just going to take off the masking fluid as well as the masking tape to reveal the white fence. Once all the surface is unmasked, I'm going to add more leaves, which are going to drape over the fence. The reason why I'm painting the leaves now is because these leaves just drape over right on top of the fence instead of touching anywhere outside of the fence. You can also add some details to the leaves. Here I'm using my liner brush and using whatever green I have left on my palette, and just using a very thin consistency so those lines doesn't become too distracting. In terms of the values, I'm going to go back and forth to the flowers or the previous parts that I've already painted. Sometimes after doing a large step, you might need to touch up on certain areas. So here I just want to make sure I get the correct balance for the values all throughout the composition. I really like how the flowers on the left look, which has a tiny bit of pink at the very tip as a slight accent in color, so I'm just going to use a very light consistency of Quin Red to paint over some of the lighter areas of those flowers. Next, I'm going to paint the shadows. For this, I used the blue mix that I already had on my palette, which has the Ultramarine Finest, Indigo, and I also used a bit of Quin Red to brighten the color slightly, and also some new Gamboge and white. This way the color is a bit more pastel and it's sort of like a purple or a warm gray color. I'm using this to paint the shadows underneath the horizontal part of the fence, as well as underneath the flowers and the leaves. To give form to the fence, I'm also going to line the right part of the fence on the left side of the fence in the composition, if that makes sense, and switch to line the left side of the fence on the right half of the fence in the composition. This might be a bit confusing, but I feel that this will add a very subtle perspective to the painting. Once I'm done, I'm going to use a very thin consistency of the warm gray to paint underneath the arrow part of, or the pointy part of the fence. This will just add a bit more depth in that area, so it looks like it has a slight curvature inwards. I'm also going to use the light consistency of this warm gray to paint some wooden texture on the fence, and this is going to be very light and subtle, so I use the light consistency to paint random vertical lines on the left side and the right side of the fence in the composition. I'm going to leave that for now and move on to paint some of the details on the looser part of the bush in front of the fence. For this, I still use the same mixtures as before, but I'm using a lighter consistency to paint some grassy and bushy texture. I'm just trying to create a bit more of a separation between the fence and this area of the painting. Everything that I'm painting here is still very light and loose, and I'm also varying the greens just like before to avoid the area looking too flat. Now that I've painted the fence, I feel like I need to add the darker values, especially behind the fence on the leaves and foliage and things like that. So here I'm just adding the darker green before in a thicker consistency. Once I'm done, I'm going to create a blurry background behind the flowers. I started out by dampening the surface with clean water, then I used the light consistency of the greens that I already had on my palette, just using whatever's left while playing around with the different variations of tone and just lightly dabbing it with my brush and letting the color bloom and mingle with each other. I'm going to add a couple more leaves in front of the fence for the hydrangeas, and I'm also going to add some wildflowers to create the base color for that. Since I've already painted all of the surface, I use a medium to thick consistency of bleed proof white, following the shape of the flowers and also the leaves. After that, I want to make sure that all the white is completely dry so I can paint on the colors on top. For the leaves, I just used the greens that I already had on my palette. As for the flowers, I decided to create this orange color from a mix of New Gamboge and Quin Red. I just find that the orange will complement the blue of the hydrangeas, but you can also use other colors as well. I decided to make the flowers like a cone shape, and I want the inside of the flowers to be lighter. So for that area, I used new Gamboge as is, and to add to the darkness of the sides of the flowers, I added a bit more Quin Red into the mix and add this color to the bottom of the flowers. Once I've painted all the flowers, I'm going to paint the stems using my liner brush. I also used a light load and a thick consistency of the dark green for this. You can use any mixtures you want though. And for the leaves, I just used whatever was left on my palette, and I'm still painting it fairly loosely because I want the leaves or the flowers to somewhat blend into the background of the bush. I'm pretty much done here, but I'm just going to balance out the values of the overall composition again. So here I have a slightly thicker version of the shadow color from Quin Red, the blues, and a little bit of sepia. I just use a thinner consistency this time to paint on some of the shadows since I'm not adding white to this. I'm also going to use this color to paint on the fence behind the bush, and this will just add a bit more depth. Lastly, I decided to darken parts of the bush behind the flowers because I felt like the lighter orange isn't popping out as much as I want to, so I'm just adding some darker green, still very loosely in some areas, especially the corners. After this, it's just all about the final adjustments, adding shadows again at the bottom of the flowers to separate them further, adding a bit of pink here and there, and also adding on some leaf textures if you would like to. And that's basically it for this painting. If you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!